Coming to my mind is the way President John F. Kennedy behaved in terms of making decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So you had the Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev coming and basing medium-range nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba. The whole crisis was called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there's a good book which was part of my study program for my international relations degree, a book written by Graham Allison regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. So when President John F. Kennedy was faced with a policy riposte, a policy response to this emerging threat, he gathered a group of people to consult. Now, this group of people were like-minded people who used to give non-critical advice. In other words, they were all yes men and women who, for the most part, concurred with the president's ideas and thinking. So there was no critical decision making. So this particular group of people advised the president to go for a nuclear blockade as to how to respond. So they brought in people with as the first in order to respond to this nuclear crisis. So when the group was expanded and a larger number of additional members were brought in, and they provided a series of options, and they in fact prioritized and graded those options. What they said was, what they advised the president to do was to use the nuclear option, the escalation of the nuclear alert, as a last resort. They first suggested strong negotiations, and if that failed, they advised to go for a naval blockade. And if the naval blockade didn't succeed, then they recommended to go for the last and the most horrendous option of escalating the nuclear alert. So the first approach was adopted. It failed. Khrushchev was stubborn and inflexible and intransigent. Then they went on to the naval blockade, and the naval blockade worked. So now this is something that I have learned. If you have a set of like-minded yes men or women who conquer persistently and consistently with your own ideas, you become a victim of a decision-making error called victims of groupthink. That was the book, Victims of Groupthink, by Graham Allison. In fact, actually a book was written on this whole episode. So similarly, one can see in Sri Lanka's democratic political history, at most times, irrespective of party politics, leaders tend to surround themselves with like-minded colleagues who have a great propensity to give uncritical advice, trying to make the decision makers feel happy. So the feel-good factor is used. Don't applaud because I don't intend on doing that. So when that happens, there are obstacles to rational decision making. The rational process is not followed. So you have automatically a bunch of people who will be saying yes, 3 bags. So that's one of the examples of where I have learned lessons from my educational experience and from the experience that I've had in the US Senate, the legislature, and the British House of Commons. And just lastly, the team. Well, I can assure you there will be a wholesale change as far as the team is concerned. I believe you should have even thought of applauding after my next sentence. Because the team can be changed, but I can also substitute them with people who have gained political patronage. Not so. We shall move away from the typical aristocratic, friendship-based, personal, relationship-based recruitment into key positions, and we will definitely adopt a highly advanced meritocratic approach where those who are capable, those who have performed, those who have excelled in their various fields and arenas, and those who have succeeded in implementing time-targeted programs. They shall be given the utmost priority, and we will have transparent, open government with no hidden agendas and certainly no hidden deals. That's why I'm fearless, and I'm open to any amount of questions that you may ask me, and so that you have some clarity with regard to the persona of Sajith Premadasa.
Thank you, Mr. Premadasa. This is, after all, a Chamber of Commerce. So I have a lot of questions in front of me that relate to the matters of commerce, of industry, of exports, of private sector. So let me pull them together in a question like this. What role do you see for the private sector in the future of the Sri Lankan economy? How do you think the private sector participation can be improved? What can the private sector do better? What can government do better to facilitate that? What is your posture towards the private sector and its future in the Sri Lankan economy?
I strongly believe that private sector is the catalyst which lubricates and enhances the growth engine of a country. I also trust that the participation of the private sector through the plethora of chambers that exist is a vital component in formulating sound economic policy. So I don't think that I need to give a expanded explanation on this particular topic, because I sincerely believe that the private sector should be consulted, and these consultative processes should be formalized and formatted. Of course, in the present day, we have various ad hoc consultations which are done according to the whims and fancies of the particular minister in charge. I would go a step further and formalize this consultative process as an indispensable requirement in the economic decision-making process. So rather than just making these consultations a political facade to give the impression that the various chambers were consulted, I would have a embedded, formatted consultative process that would enable the chambers and the members of the private sector to have a consistent consultative program, which is absolutely vital if one is to formulate sound economic policy. Because politicians are not experts in private enterprise. In fact, politicians or the ministers should have the basic knowledge and capability to consult all stakeholders in deciding upon economic policy. So I'm a pro-private sector politician, and to move on a bit further, I firmly believe in the wealth-creating system of a nation and the free market economy and the supply and demand operation and free enterprise acts as the major concept through which a country can create wealth. However, I always pay special attention to the fact that whatever income, wealth, growth that is generated, it has to be inclusive growth. And the prosperity that is created has to be shared prosperity. So I think when it comes to the redistribution of income and wealth, I subscribe not to the usual capitalist approach. When it comes to redistribution, I'm very much a social democrat. So in other words, I subscribe to a mixed economic model where you love the demand and supply system, the free market system, private entrepreneurship to flourish, and to reduce barriers to private enterprise as much as possible, to reduce all the bureaucratic inertia and the bottlenecks which have hindered the private sector from performing to its optimum level. Having said that, I fervently believe that the wealth that is created and generated has to be distributed equitably. You have to have justice and fairness in society, and basically prosperity for all.
Thank you, Mr.
Did I answer the question?
I think you answered that quite comprehensively. We would have liked to go into examples of where you empathize with the private sector, but I'm not going to do it now for shortage of time. I'm going to move on to, because we want to cover some ground in different spaces. Of course, yes, please go ahead, yeah.
Okay, what the private sector can expect from a Sajith Premadasa administration. We will, for sure, embark on an approach that would free up the private sector to use your skills and capabilities to the optimum level, and the government will not act as a hindrance to private enterprise. So we will have relaxation of inappropriate and unnecessary regulations that act as a bar towards progress and growth. We will look in a very positive manner to provide the support and incentives that the private sector needs for it to flourish. And quick decision making. Stability of policies. We will not have announcements today and reversals tomorrow. I can assure you of that. These announcements today and reversals of tomorrow take place because of the original point that I brought in. Ad hoc, non-consultative, immature decision making. And that will not take place under Sajith Premadasa administration.
This is not only
with myself. You're free to do anything you want. But if the people of this country take the wrong decision, I might have to suggest to you that there may be inhibitions and restrictions, even you consulting with your own phone.
I will take that on advice. This is not only a chamber of commerce, it's also an American chamber of commerce, as they call themselves, with many American firms that are working in Sri Lanka, as well as Sri Lankan firms working with the US present here. There are many questions that are asking about Sri Lanka's relationship with the world, with India, with China, with the United States. So if I formulate it in this way, what is your outlook on how Sri Lanka should be managing its international relationships?
Well, my international outlook is quite simple. The external relationships that we will establish will be purely based on achieving our national interest. Simple as that. Not family interests, not personal interest, but national interest. And we as a country should utilize our unique position, unique geographical location and strategic position to place ourselves in the international community in the most strategically advanced posture in order to accrue the maximum amount of benefits to the people living in our country. So I will adopt a highly realist approach, a realist power politics approach when it comes to external relations. Which particular relations will accrue and what type of relationship will provide the maximum possible benefit to our country. That will be the sole factor that will guide my external relationship. That will guide our country's external relationship under our administration.
So you think that that fidelity of relationships are not the priority, but a commitment to self-interest of Sri Lanka over past loyalties? Or how would you balance the fact that countries like Japan, many countries have had long-standing strong relationships with Sri Lanka, and yet the interests that we have may change from time to time with regard to these countries?
You refer to Japan. I think the relationship that we possess with Japan is a very constructive relationship, a relationship based on mutual trust, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. And our relationship has resulted in a lot of support to our country in terms of development programs. The JICA projects and the various JMIC programs have certainly stimulated the growth trajectories of our country. So, there you have it. Relationship with Japan is constructive, is beneficial, and there is a value addition to our country. So we will promote it. So we will have a very surgical approach, a very targeted approach in our international relationships.
So you're looking for the convergence of interest. You're looking for the convergence of interest and
yes, of course, there is a mutual give and take. The mutual benefit should accrue to both parties, to both nation states. But the main motivating factor, as far as I'm concerned, is the interest of our country. And I will strive to do that with surgical precision.
I know that time is short, so I'm going to keep us moving forward. And
since I came late, you can have some additions at the back. Which will also make the next appointment late.
I apologize to them in advance. Mr. Premadasa, the Yahapalana promise of 2015 of putting down corruption is not being evaluated very positively in society right now at the end of 4 years. Now, what is your response to those who are experiencing that disappointment? And in that context, on what basis are you inviting people to vote again for the UMP?
I do agree with those who have had many a disappointment with regard to the anti-corruption policy that our government has implemented. And I think it's fair to say that such conclusions and deductions are true to the most extent. Now, what's the alternative? The alternative is the same old family vandalism, the patriarchal political and economic oligarchy that was sapping the financial resources and assets of our motherland, assets that are owned by the people as a whole. Is that the alternative that the country is craving for? Or is it a modern approach where we will have various tools and policy instruments that will ensure that corruption is eradicated? For example, we are planning on a system of supervision and control by members of all political parties. So they will be empowered with an intrusive approach to look into the veracity of tender decisions, of how the tender processes are followed, how the technical committees have done their evaluations. I will have a multi-party committee who will be given far-reaching intrusive powers to look into the veracity of the tender processes and thereby creating an environment that is conducive to the highest norms and principles of good governance.
So you see the problem, but you see the UMP as still the best alternative in the current political context to...
Well, I have to say it will be a revamped government, as I told you before. We will have new people taking on responsibility, and we will also have inbuilt safety procedures to ensure that corruption is eradicated. And if I may just move on a bit, the system has to be completely depoliticized. The politicians should not have a say in the administration of justice. That should be under the total purview of the judiciary. I think the administration of justice has to be made more efficient. We have to depoliticize the process and ensure that politicians don't get involved in various quid pro quo activities, you know, the bargaining deals when it comes to the anti-corruption process. I think that has been the biggest issue that this country has faced during the past few decades.
Thank you. There are several questions that look on the more long-term concerns of the country, and there are two types of, I think, concerns that have been brought to me through these questions and others. One is that, you know, there are 6 million children in Sri Lanka who will not vote. They are under 18, and yet, if the future of Sri Lanka depends on the children of the present, what is your vision for the children of this country? Knowing the problems of malnutrition, of violence that children face, how are you thinking about those non-voters who are children? And I'll add to another concern that's long-term. Many people ask about your approach to environmental protection. We know we live in a world that is constantly in jeopardy for the way in which the environment has been mistreated or mishandled. And it is, again, not an immediate political consequence, because it is easy to allow short-term thinking to act in a way that is damaging to the long-term future of not only the nation but the world. So if I can put those two together, because they're long-term questions about, you know, your vision for the children of tomorrow, of today, for tomorrow, and for the environment.
We will have a children's charter that will ensure that the rights, the privileges of the children of our motherland are protected. And that particular charter will be given legal enactment through legislation. I'm very happy that you asked this question, because let me give you this example. All of us in this country brag about the free education system that we have. But we have missed the point on education as far as children are concerned. If one looks at the medical evidence available, the brain development of a child takes place to the maximum level when the child is between 0 to 5 years. If I remember correct, 70 to 80% of the brain development takes place during that time period. However, the early childhood care education, preschool education in this country is totally and absolutely unstructured, dysfunctional, chaotic, not systematized at all. So here we have the child's brain development taking place from the time he or she is born up to 5 years. 70 to 80% of the brain development takes place during that period. And at the same time, the early childhood education or the preschool education is utterly and totally chaotic. It's not free education at all. It's not structured at all. There's no monitoring. There's no management. There's no supervision. So here is one place where I'm going to commence the free education system. It will commence from preschool education for the 3 to 5 year olds who attend early childhood education institutes. They will be supervised. There will be uniformity of syllabus. We will have teachers who will be recruited with the requisite educational qualifications, training to embark on preschool education. On another note, since you mentioned malnutrition, if you look at the main malnutritional indicators, stunting, wasting, low birth weight, low weight children, anemia, I think we can improve on the indices that continue to depict a sorry state of affairs. Of course, I have to say we have made great strides during the past few decades, but there's still much more to be done. So in order to do so, we have to establish regularized child and maternal health programs at the grassroots level. We have to have the maternal and healthcare centers at the Grama Niladhari level, so that health workers are able to provide the necessary interventions. For example, the Triposha intervention. That's a food supplement that is provided in order to eradicate malnutrition. But unfortunately, we don't have the requisite infrastructure even now. We call ourselves a middle-income country, but we don't have the public health midwife officers that need to exist at the grassroots level in our country. So that will be a priority in terms of eradicating malnutrition. In addition, we have to ensure that the rights of the child is protected and that they're provided with the highest level of legal support in terms of legislation to ensure that he or she will not be subjected to various attacks by sexual predators. So legislation on that part will also be strengthened, and when it comes to those issues, we will be strong in our resolve to ensure that those who commit these heinous acts are punished to the maximum possible extent.
Thank you. Both relate to Syria, the roadmap. I'm going to ask those two questions, and after you answer those, maybe we'll give you a bit of time for closing remarks, since we didn't give you time for opening remarks.
That's the last question.
Okay.
If anybody wants to stand up and ask questions, that's fine. Or even seated, I don't mind.
So please keep your questions coming. I've seen they're so wrapped up in listening to you, Mr. Premadasa. The questions have dried up over the last half an hour. But let me
hope they have the keenness on the 16th of November to follow suit.
So let me take you to one very critical question. That's a long-standing question for the country. It's come up in different ways in the thread. the problem of violence and ethnic violence, violence and ethnic violence, and ethnic enmity that this country has faced for a long time and has resurged today in a very peculiar way, with racial violence targeting Muslim population, targeting minorities, but also now we've had bomb blasts in April, showing that the country is facing a serious issue of ethnic justice, ethnic reconciliation, and how do you look at that problem in Sri Lanka, which is a long-standing problem, and what is your sense about your approach of responding to it?
Now, in your question, you mentioned the word peculiar, in a peculiar way. To me, it's not peculiar at all. The instigation of extremism, polarization, perpetuation of xenophobia in society, that's a political instrument through which my opponents are attempting to become popular. So it's not peculiar at all. I believe it's one of their main methodologies of attaining political power. Now, having said that, as a government, we have to look at the issue of terrorism in a very serious manner. And that's why I have decided to anoint Field Marshal Sarath Fonseca, who championed the war effort, which eradicated terrorism in 2009. And I have tasked him with the responsibility of ensuring that there's perpetual peace and security within Sri Lankan society. I think there is a great need and a necessity to enact new legislation which prohibits and prevents hate speech, which prevents ethnic and religious-based violence, and it is of great importance that we try to educate the people in our country regarding the attributes and virtues of togetherness, of harmony, of peaceful interaction. So you can be rest assured that we will destroy terrorism, but we will also destroy all forms of other extremism. We will take a very strong-handed approach to counter this cancer that is destroying our society. Extremism, xenophobia, discrimination has no place in an administration that is headed by Sajith Premadasa.
So this is maybe my last question. Your team is still signaling that they need to move you on.
I'm sorry, I don't have people who prompt my timetable. I neither have teleprompter equipment nor do I have people or personnel prompting. I don't know who is doing that. I think it's your colleague who is committing this cardinal sin, and you're being economical with the truth.
Mr. Premadasa, thank you for making more time available. I think the audience here would love to talk with you as much as possible. I think that women represent 50% of the vote base, and yet often the concerns of women aren't really politically discussed or championed in the country. So we hear often women talk about it being extremely uncomfortable or difficult to navigate public transport, to walk on the street. We can see statistics on low pay for women, for discrimination of women getting into high positions in the public sector. And this has been a problem for the country over a long period of time. You know, Lee Kuan Yew, many credit his success of Singapore with Lee Kuan Yew's authoritarian tendencies. People don't think that maybe it has something to do with his policies. One of the things he said very early in his tenure was that public transport must be safe for women. I know you're going for another session with a women's group after this, but how have you thought about the problem of women in this country, and how government needs to be more attentive in addressing and reversing the difficult situation that women experience just by being women, to have a decent life at the level that men enjoy.
Here again, in terms of protecting the rights of women, I think the protection of the multifarious rights that you just mentioned has to be institutionalized. As with the children of our country, we hope to establish a women's charter. And with these charters, I hope to embark on a social contract whereby women's groups and various women's representatives will sign up with me to this particular charter. And all I have to do is to ensure that this charter is legalized and given legality for it to be implemented. I totally agree that the rights and the privileges of women in our society has to be protected. Public transport, security, free from gender-based violence, discrimination. In order to do so, it should be conducted in a regular manner. You cannot have knee-jerk reactions to the various challenges that are faced by women in society. As I said, we are establishing a women's charter. We will have the various methodologies to protect the woman in society in a structured manner, and this document will be drafted with the large range of policy inputs that we have received from various women's societies and organizations. So we will have a system and a structure to ensure that these areas which have suffered from negligence will be looked at and will be focused upon, and we will pay special attention to this valuable sector in our society.
So I think, as you pointed out, my colleagues have a lot of power over me, but they are concerned about the time. So I think, let me open it out this way. Nusrat, would you like to take charge, and you can decide whether we continue? And certainly, Mr. Premadasa should be free also to add.
Out of it, you might not be able to catch me hereafter, because I have 151 meetings to conduct throughout the country.
Okay, so then let me come back to this question of racial violence. I think there are several questions that have come to me saying, well, the violence in Minuangoda, in certain area, in Kandy, Digana, these occurred during the UMP's watch. So these can't exactly be blamed on your competitors because they were not in power and not in government during that time. What is it that went wrong, and how do you see yourself in leadership preventing those kinds of destructive violence that we have seen even during the last few years of when the UNP had the reins of government in its hand?
With great respect, I would beg to differ from the basic premise of your question. In any society, you will have various marginalized sectors who instigate these venomous and pernicious acts. To the credit of the government, we handled the issue. We ensured that the perpetrators of such crimes were brought to book. In addition to that, the government has embarked on a range of programs to ameliorate the suffering that was caused by these acts that were motivated by racial discrimination and hatred. I think we have to ensure that stronger punitive action that creates extreme hardship on the perpetrator are enacted through legislation, which would act as a foolproof deterrent for those who are attempting to embark on such transgressions. They will be motivated not to do so.
Thank you for that. So I think the minister is not going to stop me, and until you stop me, I can continue. There have been many questions that I've tried to combine with others, but perhaps it's best taken separately. You addressed the question of early childhood education and the education of children. We also know that there is a question for the youth of this country. The skills of youth, the education of youth, the higher education of youth, the preparation of youth for the job market, for succeeding in the economy, in being productive. What is the challenge that you see, and how are you thinking about addressing the challenge for the success and education of youth for the new economy?
When you refer to the youth of our country, they are a particularly disgruntled group who seem to have very little faith on the policymakers and decision makers and the governors of this country. Now, having said that, we have initiated several programs to include in our party manifesto programs that are geared towards ensuring that the youth of this country are empowered in terms of computer science education, IT education, digital technology, and English literacy skills. To this end, I have proposed the setting up of centers of excellence in all of the DS divisions in our country to ensure that the youth of the country have opportunity, irrespective of their economic background, to have access to education that is, in this particular arenas that I mentioned, education that is of international standards. So we would be promoting the development of youth who will have accessibility to employment opportunities, not merely domestically, but in the international labor market. So in terms of youth, we will, once again, I have proposed a youth charter, which will have legal teeth and legal backing through legislation, which will enhance and secure their rights and privileges as another important sector in Sri Lankan society.
I think you answered most of that question, I think, including you're thinking about the higher education side and the problems of higher education, and you can say more on that if you like. But I think when we look at the problems of corruption, when we look at the concerns of the private sector, often the bureaucracy and the efficiency and the functioning of the bureaucracy comes up as a significant issue. So you've talked about, charters, laws, programs that you'll put in place, but all these things probably are as good as the efficiency or effectiveness with which they're implemented. And we know that the Sri Lankan bureaucracy may face challenges in delivering on the good ideas and the good policies that you're advocating today. Is that a concern that you have? Have you thought about how you would address that problem?
Well, it is a concern, but I, for one, have overcome those obstacles. I would merely point out the fact that how I have implemented the housing program. When I
think we'd like to know more about how you succeed within this current context and how that success can be generalized to the national leadership here.
Right. When I assumed office on the 12th of January, at the day which I was sworn in 2015, I don't know whether you might believe what I'm trying to say. The housing ministry did not possess the vital housing statistics with regard to the people in our country. It took close upon 1.5 years to conduct a comprehensive survey in order to ascertain the housing problem of our country. And 2.5 million families suffer from housing issues of a variety of sorts. When I entered the ministry, the National Housing Development Authority, they were highly demotivated. For years and years, they had not embarked on comprehensive housing development programs. So it was a very hard task, and I think they also found me to be a very tough taskmaster. But we ensured that there were benefits and support that were given to the bureaucracy based on performance. To give you a simple example, by and large, ministries and departments receive opportunities for foreign training programs. It used to be the case that an exclusive club enjoyed these privileges prior to 2015. So, with my assumption of duties, we made the allocation of foreign trips based on their achievements in the Model Village program. So he or she who embarked on the largest number of programs were given the opportunity of enjoying the fruits of foreign training programs. So this is just one aspect, one technique of governance that I used as a policy instrument to achieve and add value to the country in terms of housing development. So don't worry about it. You have to understand I have Premadasa DNA when it comes to getting things done as far as the country is concerned. And it will be very useful for achieving much for the country. I mean the DNA.
Ms. Premadasa, I want to thank you for the time you've taken. I invite the audience to just appreciate this time.
And once again, apologies for the delayed entrance.
I think we're going to close, but please do feel free to follow up afterwards, after this session.
Yes, my name is Dr. Zorvik. In fact, and there have been a lot of problems, that is like debts in Sri Lanka from foreign countries. How are you going to solve the problems and make Sri Lanka as economy of Asia, hub of Asia? Within how many years? I know you will do it. Within how many years' time can you do it? And the second thing is about the central bank fraud. Whether you can, before you take over as a president, will you be able? Arjuna Mahendran, the central bank, who is the son of the famous Charlie Mahendran, who was aiding and everything in Japan, and there's still the in histories. I hope you will, before you become the president of Sri Lanka, you will be able to handle this. I will talk to you after. Thank you.
You just have to take this after I assume office. As far as the incident that you mentioned, you can be ready. We'll move forward, and there'll be absolutely no hindrances or obstacles to that process. As I mentioned before, the administration of justice will be conducted in a proper manner, devoid of political interference. So you can rest assured that that will take place, and I will stick to my standards. Now, before that, if I heard you right, you mentioned about the debt issue. Is that right? Yeah. So this is one of the major issues that we are facing, and one aspect of dealing with debt would be short-term stimulation of the economy to enhance, created by the national production processes, the enhanced processes. A portion can be allocated to paying off debt. Second approach, negotiate with them for a restructuring of debt, a restructuring process that would be of benefit for the short-term accelerated growth trajectory of our country. And the third thing would be ensure that whatever expenditures that you embark upon in terms of public investment programs are done in a meticulous manner where there is value addition and there is a positive rate of return for the country and the economy. I think those would be three initial steps that I would take, but there are more steps that we are contemplating with the advice that I received from experts such as Harsha De Silva, Sajith Premadasa, members of the academia in both domestic and foreign universities. So we will get the best and the brightest also involved in this process, so that there is an innovative approach, out of the box approach to grapple with this monumental problem. This is a huge problem, but we will handle it, and we will ensure that we will come out of the debt trap that we are in, and ensure that the accelerated growth path will perpetuate prosperity for all.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
And also, once you become the president, I will also help you to bring in a lot of billions into Sri Lanka.
I hope you bring them into Sri Lanka in the prim and proper